The day a man loses everything is rarely the day the world thinks he does. The ballroom shimmered beneath 1,000 crystal lights, each reflection dancing across polished marble like a celebration of power, wealth, and untouchable legacy. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore, the man who owned the night without ever raising his voice, his tailored suit perfect, his expression composed, his presence commanding the kind of silence that only true power could create. While beside him, executives laughed too loudly, investors leaned in too eagerly, and the press waited for a single glance, a single word, anything that would prove they were close enough to the empire he had built. But Ethan did not smile, not really, because control had always been his language, and tonight was supposed to be another display of it, another flawless chapter in a life that never cracked under pressure, until the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet interruption of something that did not belong, something that did not ask for permission to exist, and slowly, as if guided by instinct rather than curiosity, every head turned, every conversation softened, every breath paused, because the woman who stepped inside did not look like someone who had been forgotten. She looked like someone who had been waiting. Naomi Carter moved through the room with measured steps, her black dress simple but precise, every line of it deliberate, every movement controlled, her presence cutting through the noise without effort. And for a moment, no one spoke her name, because no one expected to see her there, not after 5 years, not after the headlines, not after the silence that followed her disappearance from the world they all believed she had been erased from. But Ethan saw her immediately, before the whispers could begin, before the realization could spread, and for the first time in years, something shifted behind his eyes, something small but undeniable, like a crack in glass that no one else could see yet. His hand tightened slightly around the champagne glass he had not tasted, his jaw setting in a way that only those closest to him would recognize, because Naomi Carter was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to walk into his world again, not after the trial. Not after the sentence. Not after the day he signed his name on a decision that had rewritten both of their lives. And yet there she was, standing under the same lights that once reflected off a ring he had placed on her finger, a ring that now rested somewhere far from this room. A symbol that had once meant promise and now meant nothing at all, or so he had convinced himself. But Naomi did not look at him immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of her presence settle into the room. Let the people who once ignored her now struggle to understand how she could stand there with such quiet certainty. And when her eyes finally met his, there was no anger, no visible pain, no trace of the woman who had once stood beside him with warmth and trust. There was only clarity, sharp and unshakable, the kind that did not ask to be understood. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not a memory, not a question, but a truth that neither of them could deny anymore, because the story everyone believed ended 5 years ago had not ended at all. It had only been waiting for the right moment to begin again. And as the first murmur rippled through the crowd, as a name was finally whispered with disbelief, as cameras subtly shifted and attention sharpened, Ethan Whitmore realized something he had never allowed himself to consider, that control was never permanent, that power was never absolute, and that the woman he had once removed from his world had just walked back into it without asking, without fear, and without anything left to lose. And somewhere beneath the weight of that realization, beneath the polished surface of the man who had everything, the first quiet fracture began to spread. 5 years earlier, the same ballroom had felt warmer, brighter, filled with a kind of golden light that made everything seem possible. And Naomi Carter had stood at the top of the grand staircase with a quiet smile, her hand resting lightly against the polished railing as she watched the city stretch endlessly beyond the glass walls. Because back then, this place was not a battlefield, it was home, or at least the closest thing she had ever allowed herself to believe in, the kind of space where dreams did not just exist, they expanded, where a woman like her could stand beside a man like Ethan Whitmore and feel, if only for a moment, that the distance between their worlds had disappeared, and Ethan had stood beside her that night, close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, close enough that his presence felt like certainty, his voice low and controlled as he spoke to investors, to board members, to people who measured worth in numbers and influence. And yet when he turned to her, there had been something softer, something almost human, a version of him that only she had been allowed to see, or so she believed, because Naomi had never needed the spotlight. She had built her place in his world through precision, through intelligence, through a quiet strength that did not demand recognition but earned it anyway. She had helped structure deals, refine strategies, anticipate risks before they surfaced. And though her name rarely appeared beside his in headlines, her presence was woven into every success the Whitmore empire claimed. And still, she never asked for credit, never questioned the balance of power, because she had trusted him, not blindly, but deeply, the kind of trust that grows slowly and then all at once, until it becomes something unshakable, until it becomes the foundation of everything. And perhaps that was the first mistake, because power does not share easily, and love inside a system built on control does not remain untouched for long. The first change had been almost invisible, a shift in timing, a hesitation in his responses, late nights that carried explanations that sounded correct but felt distant. And then Victoria Hale appeared, not as a disruption, but as an addition, a consultant, a strategist, someone introduced with polished credentials and a confidence that mirrored the world she entered. And Naomi had welcomed her, professionally, respectfully, because that was who she was, someone who built rather than questioned, someone who observed more than she reacted. But even then, there had been moments, brief and almost dismissible, where something did not align. A glance held half a second too long, a conversation that ended just as she approached, a silence that lingered after Victoria left the room. And Naomi had noticed, not because she was suspicious, but because she understood patterns, she understood systems. And when something shifted within them, she felt it before she could explain it. And still, she said nothing, because trust does not break in a single moment. It erodes quietly, one detail at a time, until the structure that once felt permanent begins to hollow from within. And the night everything changed did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with precision, the same way Ethan conducted every part of his life, the same way decisions were made behind closed doors and presented as inevitabilities. Naomi had been called into the office just after 9 in the morning, the city still waking beneath a pale sky, the light filtering through the glass walls in a way that felt colder than usual. And Ethan had not stood when she entered. He had remained seated, hands folded, expression unreadable, as if he were preparing to discuss a transaction rather than a life. And the words that followed were delivered with that same controlled clarity: an internal investigation, financial discrepancies, accounts traced back to her authorization, accusations built on documents that carried her name but not her truth. And Naomi had listened, not interrupting, not reacting, because part of her was still waiting for the moment when he would stop, when he would acknowledge the impossibility of what he was saying, when he would look at her not as a liability, but as the woman who had stood beside him through every rise. But that moment never came. And when the authorities arrived, when the quiet professionalism of procedure replaced the illusion of partnership, when her hands were guided forward and the room that once belonged to her became something distant and unreachable, Naomi did not cry. She did not plead. She did not ask him why. Because in that final second, as her eyes met his one last time before everything changed, she understood something with absolute clarity, that the man she had trusted had already made his decision long before this moment, and that whatever they had built together had never truly belonged to her at all. The courtroom had been colder than Naomi expected, not in temperature but in feeling, the kind of controlled environment where every word carried weight and every silence was deliberate. And as she sat at the defense table, her hands resting calmly in her lap, she understood that this was no longer about truth. It was about narrative, about which version of events would be accepted, repeated, and ultimately believed. Because across the room, the evidence was presented with flawless precision, documents arranged in perfect order, timelines constructed with careful logic, financial trails that seemed undeniable to anyone who did not know how easily numbers could be manipulated when power guided the hand that wrote them. And Naomi watched it all unfold with a stillness that unsettled even her own attorney, who leaned in once, voice low, asking if there was anything they could use, anything she had not told him yet. And Naomi simply shook her head, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something he did not, that the truth without power was just a whisper in a room designed to amplify control. And across the aisle, Ethan Whitmore sat with the same composed posture he carried into every boardroom, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, as if this were just another negotiation, another outcome to be secured. And for a brief moment, as a witness spoke and the room's attention shifted, his eyes moved to hers, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging. And that was when Naomi realized that whatever remained between them was not confusion or doubt. It was distance, carefully constructed and permanently maintained. And when the verdict was finally delivered, the words did not echo. They settled, quiet and final, as if the room itself had expected them all along. And Naomi rose when instructed, her movements controlled, her breathing steady, because there was nothing left to fight in that space, nothing left to argue. And as she was led away, past rows of faces that reflected curiosity more than empathy, she did not look back, not at the judge, not at the crowd, and not at the man who had once promised her a future, because she understood that closure does not come from answers, it comes from acceptance. And the moment the doors closed behind her, the world she had known ceased to exist, replaced by something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest. The facility where she would spend the next years of her life was not defined by its walls, but by its rhythm, days measured in routine, time moving not forward but inward. And at first, the silence was the hardest part, not the absence of noise, but the absence of identity, because outside those walls, Naomi Carter had been a strategist, a partner, a woman who moved through rooms with purpose, and inside, she was reduced to a name on a list, a schedule to follow, a presence to be accounted for. And yet, even there, something within her refused to disappear, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a flame that did not need oxygen to survive. She observed, she listened, she learned, not from textbooks or lectures, but from patterns, from conversations whispered between people who had lost everything and those who had learned how to rebuild without asking for permission. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Naomi began to change, not into someone new, but into someone clearer, someone who no longer relied on external validation to define her worth, someone who understood that control did not always belong to those who appeared to have it. And months turned into years, each one shaping her not through hardship, but through discipline, through the deliberate choice to remain composed, in a place designed to strip that away. And then one morning, without warning, a letter arrived, placed among the usual documents with no special indication of its significance. But Naomi recognized the name immediately, the firm that had once refused her case now requesting a review, new counsel assigned, new evidence submitted. And as she read the words, carefully, without rushing, she felt something shift, not hope, not yet, but possibility, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that waits to be understood. And for the first time in years, Naomi allowed herself to look forward, not to what had been taken from her, but to what could still be reclaimed, because somewhere beyond those walls, a different narrative had begun to form, one that did not rely on the version of events that had once defined her, and one that would not remain hidden for much longer. The review process did not begin with urgency. It began with patience, the kind that is built on certainty rather than desperation. And Naomi understood that immediately when she met Daniel Reeves for the first time, his presence calm but deliberate, his voice measured in a way that suggested he did not take cases unless he already saw the ending. And he did not speak to her like someone offering rescue. He spoke to her like someone presenting an opportunity, laying out details with precision, inconsistencies in the original financial reports, timestamps that did not align, authorizations that had been rerouted through systems she once helped design. And Naomi listened without interruption, her mind moving ahead of his words, connecting patterns, reconstructing decisions, because even after everything, she still understood the architecture of the empire better than anyone who had tried to dismantle her within it. And when he finished, when he placed the documents in front of her and allowed silence to settle between them, Naomi did not ask if they could win. She asked how long it would take, because she already knew that this was not about proving innocence. It was about exposing design, and outside those walls, the world had continued without her, Whitmore Group had expanded, headlines had praised its resilience, its strategic growth, its leadership, and Ethan Whitmore had remained untouched, his reputation polished, his influence intact, his decisions still shaping industries that moved at the speed of money. But beneath that surface, small fractures had begun to form, ones that did not yet appear in public reports but existed in conversations behind closed doors, investors questioning irregular movements, internal audits that did not fully reconcile, whispers that something within the system was misaligned, and Naomi recognized the pattern immediately, not as coincidence, but as inevitability. Because systems built on control do not collapse all at once, they shift slowly until the weight of their own design becomes impossible to sustain, and Daniel saw it too, which was why he had come to her, not just to reopen a case, but to rebuild a narrative that had been carefully rewritten years ago. And day by day, Naomi worked with him, reviewing records, identifying gaps, tracing decisions back to their origin, her mind sharp, her focus absolute, because time had not weakened her, it had refined her, removed everything unnecessary until only clarity remained. And as the case moved forward, quietly at first, then with growing momentum, filings submitted, motions approved, attention beginning to shift, Naomi felt no urgency to rush the process, because she understood something most people did not, that truth, when aligned with strategy, does not need to force its way into the light. It arrives exactly when it is meant to. And then the day came without announcement, without spectacle. Just a formal notification delivered in the same controlled manner as everything else in her life had become. Her conviction overturned, her record cleared, her name restored in language that felt almost distant after so many years of silence. And when she stepped outside, the air did not feel different. The world did not pause. There was no sudden transformation, just the quiet realization that she was no longer confined to a version of herself that had been written by someone else. And Daniel stood beside her, offering a brief nod rather than celebration, because he understood that this moment was not an ending. It was a beginning, and Naomi did not look back at the building behind her. She looked forward, already calculating, already planning, because freedom was not the goal, it was the foundation, and somewhere across the city, in an office that overlooked the same skyline that had once belonged to both of them, Ethan Whitmore was preparing for another day built on control. Unaware that the structure he relied on had already begun to shift beneath him, unaware that the narrative he had secured years ago was no longer his to manage. And as Naomi stepped into the waiting car, her reflection steady in the tinted glass, she did not feel anger, she did not feel the need for confrontation. She felt something far more powerful, something precise and unshakable. She felt ready. The city did not announce her return, but it felt different as Naomi Carter moved through it again, not because the streets had changed, but because she had. The skyline that once represented a life she had built beside someone else now felt like a map of opportunities she would navigate on her own terms. And in the weeks that followed her release, she did not rush to reclaim attention, she did not grant interviews, she did not correct the narrative publicly, because she understood that visibility without strategy was just noise. And Naomi had no intention of making noise. She was building something far more precise, something that would not rely on explanation but on impact. And Daniel Reeves remained close, not as a protector, but as a partner in execution, helping her access records that had once been sealed, guiding her through the legal pathways that now opened instead of closed. And together they reconstructed the timeline that had been altered years ago, tracing financial movements not just to prove her innocence, but to reveal intent, because intent was where the Betrayal story lived. And as Naomi studied the patterns, one detail became impossible to ignore. The structure of the transactions that had implicated her did not originate from a single decision. They were layered, deliberate, built to withstand scrutiny unless someone knew exactly where to look. And Naomi did, because she had once designed systems to prevent this kind of manipulation, systems that Ethan had trusted her to create, systems that had later been used against her with a precision that now felt almost personal. And for the first time since her release, Naomi allowed herself to consider the possibility that what had happened was not just convenience. It was planning, and that realization did not bring anger. It brought clarity, because if it had been planned, it could be dismantled. and across the city, within the glass walls of Whitmore Group headquarters, the atmosphere had begun to shift in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Meetings that once moved with effortless confidence now carried hesitation. Reports that once aligned perfectly now required revision. And Ethan Whitmore, who had built his reputation on anticipating risk before it emerged, found himself reviewing details more than once. Not because he had lost control, but because something within the system no longer responded with the same predictability, and he did not yet know why, but he felt it. The same way Naomi had once felt the first cracks in their life together, and late one evening, long after the office had quieted and the city lights reflected against the glass like distant signals, Ethan stood alone in his office, reviewing a set of internal audit notes that did not match prior records. His expression unchanged, his posture composed, but his focus sharper than usual, because the inconsistencies were small, almost insignificant, but they were precise, targeted in a way that suggested intention rather than error. And as he traced the data, following the pattern backward, he paused, just for a moment, because something about the structure felt familiar, not in its execution, but in its design, and that recognition did not come with certainty. It came with a question he did not allow himself to fully form, because the answer would require him to consider something he had already dismissed. And across town, Naomi sat in a quiet office that overlooked the same skyline, the city stretching beneath her like a system she was learning to read again, her reflection steady in the glass, her posture relaxed but intentional, and on the table before her lay the final piece she had been waiting for, a document that connected the transactions not just to her name, but to the origin of the manipulation, a signature that had been hidden within layers of authorization, a detail so carefully buried that it had gone unnoticed for years. And Naomi did not react immediately. She simply studied it, confirming what she had already begun to understand. And when she finally looked up, her voice calm as she spoke to Daniel, there was no hesitation in her words, because this was not a discovery, it was a confirmation, and with that, the next phase began, not as a confrontation, not as a reaction, but as a calculated progression toward a moment that would not just reveal the truth, but redefine it entirely. And somewhere between the silence of her preparation and the uncertainty beginning to surface within Ethan's world, the balance that had once favored power alone began to shift towards something far more dangerous, something far more controlled, something that no longer belonged to him. Control does not disappear all at once. It erodes in places no one thinks to look. And Ethan Whitmore began to notice that erosion not in headlines or stock prices, but in the quiet spaces between decisions, the moments where certainty used to exist without effort and now required attention. His days remained structured. Meetings began on time, reports were delivered with precision, and the world still responded to his presence with the same measured respect. But beneath that surface, something no longer aligned, and Ethan, who had built his empire on the ability to recognize patterns before they became problems, found himself pausing more often, reviewing details that should have been unquestionable. And the more he examined the discrepancies, the more they revealed a consistency that could not be dismissed as coincidence, because errors do not repeat with intention, and this did. The financial pathways looping back through internal systems, the approvals appearing valid, but layered in a way that suggested design rather than oversight. And as he traced the structure further, he began to recognize something that unsettled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was precise, too precise, built by someone who understood not only the system, but his expectations of it. And across the city, Naomi Carter sat in silence that was anything but empty, her office minimal, her environment controlled, every detail intentional, because she had learned that clarity was not just a state of mind, it was a strategy. And on the screen before her, the architecture of Whitmore Group unfolded like a map she had memorized years ago, every division, every financial channel, every point where influence intersected with decision, and she did not rush, she did not react. She moved through it methodically, adjusting variables, introducing pressure in places that would not immediately reveal disruption, but would require correction, and correction was where exposure lived, because systems do not reveal their weaknesses when attacked. They reveal them when they are forced to adapt, and Naomi understood that better than anyone, and Daniel watched her work without interruption, Recognizing that what she was doing was not retaliation, it was reconstruction. She was not trying to take something from Ethan. She was allowing the structure he relied on to reveal what it had always concealed. And as the days passed, the effects began to surface, subtle at first, a delayed report here, an unexpected variance there, but always within a margin that required attention, and attention, when sustained, becomes doubt, and doubt, in an environment built on certainty, spreads quickly, and in the boardroom, where confidence had once been unshakable, questions began to form, not accusations, not yet, but inquiries that required answers, and Ethan responded as he always had, with control, with logic, with a calm that reassured those around him. But even as he spoke, even as he guided the conversation back to stability, part of his focus remained elsewhere, tracing the origin of something he could not yet name. And late one evening, as the city settled into the quiet rhythm of night, he returned to the same set of records, the same pattern that had drawn his attention before. And this time, he did not look at the numbers, he looked at the structure, the sequencing of approvals, the timing of transfers, the alignment of decisions, and when it finally became clear, it did not arrive as a realization. It arrived as recognition. The design was not just familiar. It was hers, not copied, not imitated, but built from the same logic, the same discipline, the same understanding of how power moved through systems. And Ethan leaned back slightly, the smallest shift in posture, but enough to signal that something had changed, because the question he had avoided now stood directly in front of him, not as a possibility, but as a certainty he could no longer ignore. And across the city, Naomi closed the final file of the day, her reflection steady in the darkened glass as the skyline glowed behind her. And for a moment, she allowed herself stillness, not to reflect on what had been done to her, but to acknowledge what she had built in its place, because this was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about alignment, about ensuring that every step moved toward a single, inevitable point. And as she reached for the document that connected everything, the one piece that would transform doubt into truth, her expression remained calm, her focus absolute, because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to realize, that control is not defined by who holds it first, but by who understands it last. And she had been learning for 5 years. Recognition is a quiet thing. It does not arrive with certainty or declaration. It settles slowly, reshaping everything it touches until denial is no longer sustainable. And for Ethan Whitmore, that recognition did not come as shock. It came as inevitability, the kind he had built his entire life predicting for others, but had never expected to experience himself. Because once he allowed the thought to exist, once he stopped resisting the pattern that had begun to form, every detail aligned. With a clarity that could not be undone, the precision, the restraint, the deliberate timing of each disruption within his company. It was not random, it was not external pressure, it was design, and not just any design, it was hers. And yet even then, Ethan did not react immediately. He did not call meetings, he did not confront his executives. He did not allow even a hint of uncertainty to surface in the world that depended on his control. Instead, he adjusted, just as Naomi had expected, reinforcing systems, tightening oversight, redirecting internal reviews, because control, once threatened, does not retreat, it fortifies, and for a brief moment, the structure held, reports stabilized, numbers aligned, confidence returned just enough to suggest that whatever disruption had occurred was now contained. And across the city, Naomi watched it happen without surprise, because this was the phase she had accounted for, the moment where resistance would attempt to restore equilibrium. And she did not push against it, she allowed it, because restoration creates visibility. It forces systems to expose the very mechanisms they use to protect themselves. And that exposure was where her advantage existed. And as Ethan reinforced his control, Naomi introduced a single adjustment, small, precise, almost invisible, a shift in timing within a sequence of approvals that would not fail immediately, but would require intervention, and intervention, when layered upon an already stressed system, creates divergence, and divergence, when repeated, becomes undeniable. And within days, the pattern reappeared, not as a disruption, but as a question, one that moved quietly through internal channels. One that reached Ethan not as an alarm, but as a detail that required clarification, and this time, when he reviewed it, he did not search for error, he searched for intention, and the answer was immediate, because the structure was not just familiar, it was deliberate in a way that only someone with complete understanding could execute. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to consider not just who was responsible, but why. And the answer to that question did not lie in the data, it lay in the past. In decisions made with certainty, in actions taken without hesitation, in a moment where control had been absolute and unchallenged. And as that realization settled, it did not bring regret, it brought awareness, because regret implies uncertainty, and Ethan had never doubted his decisions. But awareness is different. Awareness recognizes consequence, and consequence, once understood, cannot be ignored. And across the city, Naomi prepared for the next phase with the same quiet precision that had guided every step she had taken since her release. The document in front of her no longer just evidence, but leverage, not to destroy, but to reveal, because destruction is immediate, but revelation is permanent. And as she reviewed the final sequence of actions, aligning each detail with the moment she had already chosen, her focus remained steady, her intention clear, because this was not about confrontation, it was about timing, and timing, when controlled, transforms truth into inevitability. And in his office, Ethan stood once more before the glass that reflected the city he had built his empire within. His expression unchanged, his posture as composed as ever. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, not externally, not visibly, but internally, a recognition that control was no longer singular, that the system he commanded was no longer entirely his. And as he turned away from the window, returning to the desk where decisions were made and maintained, he understood something he had not needed to consider in years, that the next move would not be his alone to determine, and somewhere between that realization and the quiet certainty that guided Naomi's every step, the distance between power and truth narrowed, not dramatically, not visibly, but inevitably. Timing does not announce itself. It reveals itself through alignment, through the quiet convergence of decisions that no longer resist each other. And Naomi Carter understood that the moment she had been building toward was no longer approaching. It had arrived, not as a single event, but as a sequence already in motion, and she did not accelerate it. She allowed it to unfold, because control at this stage was not about action. It was about restraint, and across the city, Whitmore Group prepared for its annual investor gala, an event designed to reinforce confidence, to project stability, to remind the world that power, when properly managed, appears effortless. And Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of that preparation with the same precision that had defined his career. Every detail reviewed, every variable accounted for, every narrative aligned with the image he intended to maintain. And yet beneath that surface, the pattern had not disappeared, it had evolved. The discrepancies no longer isolated, now interconnected, forming a structure that could not be dismissed without deeper examination. And Ethan, who once would have delegated such concerns, now reviewed them personally, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because he understood that this was no longer about error, it was about intent, and intent requires presence. And as the final reports were delivered, as the last confirmations were secured, he paused, just briefly, his attention drawn not to what was visible, but to what remained just beyond it, the same sense of alignment that had once defined his control now existing outside of him. And that realization did not disrupt his composure, it refined it, because if this was design, then it followed logic, and logic could be anticipated. And across the city, Naomi prepared in silence, her reflection steady as she adjusted the final detail of her appearance. The black dress chosen not for attention, but for precision, its simplicity carrying a weight that did not require explanation. And on the table beside her lay the document that connected everything, the signature that had remained hidden beneath layers of authority, the proof not of error, but of orchestration. And she did not hold it with urgency. She did not treat it as a weapon. She treated it as alignment, because its value was not in its existence, but in its timing. And as she stepped into the waiting car, the city unfolding before her like a system she now controlled from the outside, she did not think about the years that had passed. She did not revisit what had been taken. She focused only on what remained to be revealed, and the gala began as it always did, with light, with music, with the quiet hum of influence moving through conversation, and Ethan Whitmore stood where he always stood, composed, measured, his presence anchoring the room. And when he spoke, the words carried the same confidence that had built his empire, the same clarity that reassured those who depended on it. And for a moment, it appeared unchanged, the system intact, the narrative secure, until the doors opened, and the room shifted, not dramatically, not immediately, but perceptibly, as attention moved towards something that did not fit within expectation, and Naomi Carter entered without hesitation, her steps unhurried, her presence undeniable not because it demanded recognition, but because it aligned with something the room could not ignore, and Ethan saw her before anyone spoke her name, before the realization spread, and this time, the recognition was immediate, not as memory, but as confirmation, because the pattern he had traced, the design he had identified, now stood in front of him, not hidden within systems, but visible, precise, and completely intentional. And as Naomi moved through the room, her gaze steady, her focus absolute, the distance between past and present collapsed into a single moment, one that neither of them had rushed, one that neither of them could avoid, and somewhere between the silence that followed her arrival and the awareness that settled across the room, the final alignment took shape, not as confrontation, not as chaos, but as inevitability, because truth, when timed correctly, does not disrupt, it replaces. Silence, when it is controlled, becomes the most powerful form of attention, and as Naomi Carter stepped fully into the light of the ballroom, the conversations that had once defined the room began to dissolve into something quieter, something more focused, because recognition does not need to be announced when it arrives with certainty, and one by one, the people who had once read her name in headlines, who had accepted a version of her story without question, now found themselves recalibrating in real time, their expressions shifting not dramatically, but subtly, as understanding replaced assumption, and Naomi did not acknowledge them. She did not slow, she did not adjust her pace to match their reactions, because she was not there to be seen. She was there to complete something that had already begun long before she entered the room, and at the center of it all, Ethan Whitmore remained still, his posture unchanged, his composure intact, but his attention now fully aligned with hers, not as surprise, not as uncertainty, but as confirmation, because everything he had traced, every pattern he had followed, now stood before him with clarity he could not deny, and when their eyes met, there was no hesitation, no attempt to mask what both of them understood, that this moment was not spontaneous, it was designed, and for the first time, the control he had relied on was no longer singular, it was shared, and that shift, though invisible to everyone else, redefined the entire room, and Naomi stopped just within the center of the space, not close enough to invade, not distant enough to be ignored, her presence measured, her timing exact, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not need to, because clarity carries further than volume ever could. 5 years ago, a decision was made in this room, she said, her words steady, precise, each one placed with intention, a decision that was accepted as truth because it was presented with authority, and the room did not interrupt, it listened, not out of obligation, but because something in her tone made interruption impossible, and Ethan did not move, did not respond, because he understood that this was not a conversation, it was a sequence, and Naomi continued, her gaze never leaving his. Tonight is not about revisiting that decision, it is about completing it. And with that, she reached for the document she had carried with her, not raising it as evidence, not displaying it for effect, but placing it, carefully, deliberately, on the table between them. The gesture simple, almost understated, and yet it shifted everything, because it was not the action itself, it was what it represented, alignment. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the absence of reaction had become its own form of attention, and Ethan's gaze dropped, just briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, because he did not need to read it to understand what it contained. He recognized its existence before it was ever placed before him. and when he looked up again, the room had already begun to change, not physically, but perceptually. The certainty that once defined it now replaced by something far more fragile, something that could not be easily restored. And Naomi did not press further. She did not explain. She did not accuse, because she understood that truth, when positioned correctly, does not require reinforcement. It sustains itself, and as the first ripple of realization moved through the room, subtle, contained, but undeniable, the structure that had once supported a single narrative began to separate into something more complex, something that no longer aligned with the version that had been accepted for years. And Ethan Whitmore, who had built his entire life on managing perception, now stood within a moment that could not be managed in the same way, because this was not about perception, it was about origin, and origin, once revealed, does not return to silence. And as the weight of that settled, not just within him, but within everyone who now understood that what they had believed was incomplete, Naomi took a single step back, not retreating, not yielding, but concluding, because this was never about staying, it was about arriving, and in that precise, controlled moment, the balance that had once defined power itself shifted, not through force, not through conflict, but through something far more absolute, truth placed exactly where it could no longer be ignored. Power rarely collapses in noise, it unravels in silence. And as the weight of Naomi Carter's words settled into the room, the atmosphere did not erupt, it tightened, the kind of shift that moves beneath the surface, altering perception before anyone dares to acknowledge it aloud. And Ethan Whitmore remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, but the space around him no longer responded in the same way, because control, once unquestioned, had now been interrupted by something far more precise, something that could not be redirected or contained through influence alone. And for a moment, no one reached for the document. No one stepped forward to challenge or confirm, because the presence of it was already enough. Its placement more powerful than any explanation could have been, and Ethan understood that immediately, not because he needed to see it, but because he recognized the structure behind it. The same structure he had once relied on, now turned toward him with a clarity that could not be dismissed, and slowly, deliberately, he reached forward, his movement controlled, his hand steady as it lifted the document from the table, not as a reaction, but as acknowledgement. And as his eyes moved across the page, the room remained still, not waiting for his response, but recalibrating around the absence of certainty that had once defined him. And Naomi did not watch him closely. She did not seek confirmation in his reaction, because she had already moved beyond that need, her focus no longer tied to his understanding, but to the alignment she had created. And as Ethan finished reading, the smallest pause followed, not hesitation, but recognition, because what lay before him was not an accusation. It was a reconstruction, a precise mapping of decisions, approvals, and authorizations that traced the origin of the narrative that had once removed her from his world. And for the first time, the design he had accepted as complete revealed itself as incomplete, not because it lacked structure, but because it lacked truth. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained steady, controlled, the same tone that had guided countless negotiations, but now carrying a different weight, one that did not seek to persuade, but to understand. "You planned this," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. And Naomi's response was immediate, not defensive, not confrontational, simply aligned. "No," she said, her voice calm, precise. "I allowed it to reveal itself." And the distinction, though subtle, shifted everything, because planning implies control over events, while revelation implies control over timing. And timing, in this moment, belonged entirely to her, and around them. The room began to move again, not with confidence, but with caution, conversations restarting in quieter tones, attention dividing between what had been said and what remained unspoken, because influence does not disappear instantly, but it does weaken when certainty is removed. And Ethan understood that as clearly as he understood the document in his hand, because for the first time, the system he commanded was no longer aligned with his narrative alone. It had been opened, not broken, but exposed. And exposure changes everything, not through force, but through awareness. And as he placed the document back on the table, his gaze returning to Naomi, there was no visible collapse, no dramatic shift, but something within his control had been altered in a way that could not be restored to its previous state. And Naomi, who had once stood in that same room without power, now stood within it without the need for it. Because what she carried was not influence, it was clarity. And clarity, when positioned correctly, does not compete. It replaces. And as the evening continued, as the structure of the event attempted to reassert itself, the narrative that had once defined everything no longer held in the same way, because it had been interrupted at its origin, and origin, once questioned, cannot return to certainty. And as Naomi turned, her movement unhurried, her presence no longer needing to remain, she did not look back, not at Ethan, not at the room, because this moment had never been about witnessing the result. It had been about initiating it. And as she walked away, leaving behind not silence, but awareness, the balance that had once belonged entirely to one side now existed in a space neither of them could fully control, and that space, quiet and undeniable, marked the beginning of something far more irreversible than any decision that had come before it. Consequences do not arrive with announcement. They unfold through recognition, through the quiet but irreversible shift in how the world begins to interpret what it once accepted without question. And in the days that followed the gala, that shift moved through Whitmore Group with a precision that no strategy could contain, not as scandal, not as collapse, but as inquiry, the kind that does not accuse immediately but lingers, asking for clarity, asking for alignment, and Ethan Whitmore felt it, before it was ever spoken directly, in the tone of conversations that carried a fraction less certainty, in the pauses that followed his decisions, in the way information was now presented not as confirmation, but as something awaiting validation, and he responded as he always had, with control, with measured adjustments, with an attempt to stabilize the system from within. But this time, the system did not respond in the same way. Because once awareness enters a structure, it cannot be removed, it reshapes everything. And across the city, Naomi Carter did not monitor the outcome. She did not track reactions. She continued forward, her focus fixed not on what was happening to Ethan, but on what she was building beyond him. Because the moment she had created was never meant to hold her in place, it was meant to free her from it. And Daniel Reeves watched the progression with a quiet understanding, recognizing that the case they had reopened had already achieved something far beyond legal restoration. It had redefined perception, and perception, once altered, carries consequences that extend far beyond any single decision. And within Whitmore Group, internal reviews intensified, not dramatically, but consistently, departments revisiting processes, compliance teams re-examining authorizations, and what had once been isolated discrepancies now revealed connections that had gone unnoticed, not because they were invisible, but because they had never been questioned. And Ethan, who had built his leadership on the ability to remain ahead of uncertainty, now found himself within it, not without control, but without exclusivity over it. And that distinction, subtle but profound, marked the beginning of something he could not fully reverse, because control shared is not control lost, but it is control transformed, and transformation, when unplanned, requires adaptation. And adaptation was not something Ethan resisted, but it was something he had never needed to rely on in this way, not within his own system, not within a structure he had once defined entirely. And as reports continued to arrive, as patterns became clearer, as the origin of certain decisions traced back to moments he could no longer dismiss as isolated, the understanding settled, not as regret, not as disbelief, but as acceptance of consequence. And acceptance, though quiet, carries weight, because it does not argue. It integrates, and across the city, Naomi stood once more before the skyline. The same view that had once symbolized a life built beside someone else now reflecting something entirely her own. And for the first time since her return, she allowed herself to pause, not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge the distance she had traveled beyond it, because what had been taken from her had not defined her, it had refined her. And as she turned away from the glass, her next steps already forming with the same clarity that had guided everything she had done. She did not think about Ethan, not as he was now, not as he had been then, because Her story was no longer connected to his in the way it once had been. It had moved beyond it. And within the quiet unfolding of consequence and the steady progression of her own path, the balance that had once defined their world no longer existed, replaced by something far more precise, something that did not rely on control alone, but on understanding, and understanding, once achieved, does not need to assert itself. It simply remains, unshaken, undeniable, and entirely her own. Closure does not always arrive as an ending. Sometimes it arrives as a conversation that no longer holds power over you. And for the first time since the night everything had been taken from her, Naomi Carter found herself standing in a space that once defined her past without feeling bound to it. The Whitmore Group headquarters rising behind glass and steel, just as it always had, unchanged in structure but altered in meaning. And when she stepped inside, there was no resistance, no hesitation. From the reception desk, no questioning of her presence, because recognition had replaced assumption, and the narrative that once excluded her had been rewritten without her needing to announce it. And as she moved through the building, the quiet acknowledgement and passing glances did not seek to diminish or elevate her. It simply existed, a reflection of truth settling into place. And at the top floor, beyond the familiar doors that once separated power from access, Ethan Whitmore stood waiting. Not because he had requested her presence, but because he understood that this moment, like everything else that had unfolded, was inevitable, and when she entered, the space between them was not defined by distance, but by history, a history that no longer needed to be defended or explained, because both of them understood it completely, and for a moment, neither spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because words, when overused, dilute meaning, and this was not a moment that required excess. And when Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice remained controlled, but without the certainty that had once accompanied it. "You could have destroyed everything," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation, and Naomi met his gaze without reaction. Her expression steady, her posture relaxed in a way that no longer carried tension. "I did not need to," she replied, her tone even, her words precise. Everything was already built on something incomplete, and the truth of that statement did not challenge him. It settled, because he had already come to understand it in his own way, through the unraveling of systems, through the shift in perception, through the realization that control, when based on a mission, cannot sustain itself indefinitely. And Ethan moved slightly, not as retreat, but as adjustment, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the desk as he considered her, not as the woman he had once known, but as the one who now stood in front of him, defined not by what had happened, but by what she had done with it. And there was no anger in his expression, no visible regret, but there was something else, something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and Naomi did not search for it, did not acknowledge it, because she had moved beyond the need to interpret him, and as the silence returned, it did not feel unresolved. It felt complete, the kind of silence that follows understanding rather than confusion. And after a moment, Ethan spoke again, this time without the structure that had once defined his words. "I believed I was protecting what I had built," he said. And Naomi's response came without delay, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply aligned with the truth she had come to understand. "You were protecting what you thought you controlled," she said, and the distinction, subtle but undeniable, marked the difference between who they had been and who they had become. And for the first time, Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to counter, nothing to negotiate, only something to accept. And Naomi stepped back, not because she needed distance, but because the moment had reached its natural conclusion. And as she turned, her movement unhurried, her presence no longer tied to the space she was leaving. There was no final statement, no need to claim victory or closure, because both had already been achieved without declaration. And as she walked away, the building that had once represented everything she had lost no longer held that meaning. It had become something else, something resolved. And behind her, Ethan Whitmore remained where he stood, not diminished, not broken, but changed in a way that could not be undone, because understanding, once reached, does not disappear. It reshapes everything that follows. And as the distance between them grew, not in steps but in meaning, The past that had once connected them no longer defined either of them, replaced instead by something far more precise, something neither of them could control, but both of them now understood.